Is that some kind of joke? The voice, sharp and laced with condescension, sliced through the thick air of the training grounds. Staff Sergeant Jack Turner stood tall, his uniform sharp, his arms crossed. He looked down at the old man, Frank Mason, who stood at the edge of the shooting range, quietly observing the younger soldiers. His grey hair was tucked beneath an old cap, his hands calloused and worn from years of hard work. The sun beat down on the dusty field, but Frank remained still, his expression unreadable. "You sure you know what you're doing, old man?" Jack scoffed. Frank didn't answer. The younger soldiers snickered, whispering amongst themselves. Jack, confident in his youth and experience, gestured toward the target set up 2 miles away. "Tell you what, if you can even hit that, I'll buy you a drink after the training." He laughed, and the soldiers around him followed suit, their laughter echoing off the distant mountains. Frank stood there, unfazed by the mockery. The target, barely a dot on the horizon, seemed unreachable to anyone who wasn't seasoned in the ways of true combat. But Frank had been to places most people couldn't even imagine. His past was a quiet legend, hidden beneath the surface of his stoic demeanor. As the laughter faded, Frank reached for his rifle, the old weapon feeling like an extension of his own body. He adjusted his stance, taking a deep breath. The young soldiers were still laughing, oblivious to the gravity of what was about to unfold. Frank didn't rush. He never did. His movements were deliberate, precise. The younger soldiers thought this was a game, but Frank knew better. He wasn't here to prove anything to them. He was here to remind them of what real skill looked like. He glanced at the target again, his eyes narrowing slightly. The wind, though light, was unpredictable. It was the kind of wind that whispered secrets, bending the path of any bullet that dared to defy it. Frank took another breath, his steady hands never wavering. He aimed. The rifle's weight was familiar in his hands, its power a quiet hum in the back of his mind. He knew this rifle well. It had been with him through thick and thin. A veteran of wars long past, it had seen things no man should ever witness. And yet here he was, standing alone, facing a challenge no one else could comprehend. Frank pulled the trigger. The shot rang out, echoing like a distant thunderclap. For a moment, everything fell silent. The soldiers, who had been mocking him just seconds ago, were now frozen. The laughter died in their throats as they watched the distant target. Then, slowly, almost impossibly, the target shifted. The shot had hit dead center, 2 miles away. The rifle's report still echoed in the air. Jack turned to Frank, his face pale, his mouth agape. The laughter that had filled the air moments ago was now replaced by stunned silence. Frank lowered his rifle, his expression still unreadable. His eyes met Jack's, but there was no smugness, no victory in his gaze. Just quiet respect for the weapon in his hands and the memory of all the battles it had survived. Jack, now realizing the magnitude of what he had just witnessed, slowly took a step back. The other soldiers, too, stood frozen, unable to comprehend how someone so old, so seemingly ordinary, could have made such an incredible shot. Frank, with nothing more than a brief glance, turned and began walking away. He didn't need to say anything. His actions had spoken louder than words ever could. The silence hung in the air, thick with the weight of respect that had suddenly, and irrevocably, been earned. The wind was still, barely a whisper against the dry earth as Frank Mason made his way back to the edge of the training field. His old boots kicked up small puffs of dust, each step deliberate, each step a reminder of the battles he had fought in the past. The young soldiers were still frozen in disbelief, staring at the target in the distance. Captain Jack Carter stood off to the side, his hands clenched into fists, his pride shattered by the old veteran's effortless precision. It wasn't just a shot. It was a reminder of the kind of soldier Frank Mason had been, and still was. He'd been quiet through it all, not seeking approval, not needing validation. But the silence that hung in the air now was more telling than any words could be. Frank stopped by the bench where his rifle lay, the weight of it now lighter in his hands. It wasn't about the shot. It never had been. It was about what the rifle represented, the countless lives it had touched, the missions it had seen, the memories it carried. As Frank reached down to pick it up, a voice broke the silence. "Sir, can I talk to you?" It was Lance Corporal Jason Webb, a young man who had been watching from the back of the group. His voice was hesitant, almost unsure of what to say, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of respect. Frank didn't answer right away. He just stared at the rifle, his fingers tracing the worn stock, lost in thought. Finally, he turned to face the young soldier. "What's on your mind?" he asked, his voice calm, steady, like a man who had seen it all and knew there was little left that could surprise him. Jason shifted on his feet, his uniform freshly pressed, the kind of neatness that came with inexperience. I didn't think you could do it. I didn't think anyone could." 2 miles? Frank nodded slowly, his expression unchanged. "That's the thing about distance, son. It's not about how far it is. It's about knowing how to read the wind, how to feel the shot in your bones. A long shot is just a test of patience." Jason looked down at the ground, his words stumbling over each other. I thought you were just an old man, out of his prime." "I didn't know." Frank stepped closer, his boots making soft thuds against the dry earth. He could see the uncertainty in Jason's eyes, the fear of being exposed for what he truly was. A man who had been raised on technology, who relied on gadgets and devices to do the work for him. "We all have our strengths," Frank said, his voice soft but firm. "Some of us rely on technology, and some of us rely on experience. The difference is that experience doesn't fade." Jason nodded slowly, his eyes widening as the realization hit him. Frank didn't need to say more. The young soldier's understanding was enough. The rest of the group began to shift, murmuring amongst themselves. They were starting to understand too, what it meant to be tested by someone who had already passed the hardest tests life had to offer. Jack Carter, still standing off to the side, swallowed hard, his face pale. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected Frank to be more than a relic of the past, someone who couldn't possibly measure up to the new generation of soldiers. But here Frank was, standing in front of him, as solid and unyielding as the rifle in his hands. The silence that filled the air was no longer uncomfortable. It was a silence of respect, one that the old man had earned. Jack stepped forward, his eyes meeting Frank's. For the first time, there was no condescension, no mockery in his gaze. Just a quiet understanding. "I misjudged you, Mason," Jack said, his voice low but steady. Frank didn't smile. He didn't need to. He simply nodded once, his gaze returning to the rifle in his hands. "That's all right," he said quietly. "We all do." The group slowly dispersed, the weight of the moment lingering in the air. Jason walked away, his head held higher than before. Jack lingered for a moment longer, watching Frank as he cleaned his rifle. The young captain knew one thing for sure now. Some legends never die. They just fade into the background, waiting for the right moment to remind everyone who they really are. The days after the shot passed quietly, but the air at the base was different. Frank Mason had been a quiet presence, his reputation now spoken about in hushed tones. The young soldiers, once eager to mock him, now found themselves watching him with a mixture of curiosity and newfound respect. Frank never asked for the respect, never expected it. He simply went about his days, doing what he always did, quietly observing, never drawing attention to himself. Yet, something had changed in the way they looked at him. The first signs came when Lance Corporal Jason Webb approached Frank one afternoon, the weight of a question hanging on his lips. "Sir, would you mind showing me how to properly handle the rifle? I want to learn from the best." The request was simple, but it carried a weight Jason had never felt before. Frank looked at him for a long moment, his gaze steady and calm. "It's not about the rifle, son," he said finally, his voice low but firm. "It's about knowing when to pull the trigger and why." Jason nodded, unsure of how to respond. Frank had a way of speaking that made everything feel more significant. It wasn't just about shooting, it was about purpose. Frank handed him the rifle, his movement slow and deliberate. Let the rifle rest in your hands, not just in your arms. Feel its weight, its rhythm. Then, you'll understand what it means to be in control. Jason took the rifle, trying to absorb every word, every motion. It was as if Frank had been teaching him more than just technique. He was teaching him how to think, how to see beyond the moment and into the deeper truths of what it meant to be a soldier. The sun hung low in the sky as Frank demonstrated, his hands moving with the precision that only comes from years of experience. The sound of the shot echoed in the stillness, but this time, it wasn't just a test of skill, it was a lesson in respect. The weeks passed, and slowly, more of the soldiers approached Frank, each with their own questions, each eager to learn, not just about marksmanship, but about life on the field. Frank never asked for any of it. He simply shared what he knew, knowing that the lessons were more valuable than anything he could say. One afternoon, Captain Jack Carter found himself walking toward Frank, his pace slower than usual. The man who had once doubted Frank now found himself facing him, but this time, there was no mockery, no condescension. "Frank," Jack began, his voice softer than it had ever been. "I wanted to apologize. For everything. I underestimated you, and I didn't see what you were really capable of." Frank turned to face him, his expression as calm as ever. He didn't say anything at first, just looked at Jack, the silence stretching between them. Finally, Frank spoke, his voice steady. "You weren't the only one who underestimated me," he said, his eyes narrowing slightly. "But it's all right. You've learned now. And that's what matters." Jack nodded, the weight of his apology settling in. He had learned more from Frank in those few moments than in any training exercise or lecture he had ever been a part of. As Frank turned back to gather his gear, Jack watched him, still in awe of the man who had, without a word, shown him what true strength looked like. It wasn't in the size of the rifle or the distance of the shot. It was in the quiet resilience of a man who had seen it all, who had survived it all, and who never once needed to prove himself. As Frank left the field that evening, Jack stood in the fading light, watching him disappear into the distance. It was a moment of realization, one that would stay with him forever. True strength was never about what you could show. It was about what you could teach without ever speaking a word. Weeks passed, and the air at the base grew quieter. The once rowdy, mocking group of soldiers that surrounded Frank Mason was now replaced by a quieter respect, a subtle shift in the way they moved around him. The old man had become more than just a figure in the background. He was a part of their world now, not because he sought their approval, but because he had earned it in the most profound way, through experience and integrity. One afternoon, as Frank sat by the edge of the base, polishing his rifle, Lance Corporal Jason Webb approached again. He was no longer hesitant, no longer unsure of what he wanted to ask. "Sir," Jason began, his voice steady. "Can you tell me about one of your missions? Something that made you who you are." Frank looked up from the rifle, his weathered hand stilling for a moment. It was a simple question, but one that carried the weight of a lifetime. He thought for a moment, then set the rifle down beside him. "You want to know who I am?" Frank said, his voice low but clear. "You want to know what made me the man I am today?" He met Jason's eyes, and for the first time, Jason saw the depth of what Frank had experienced. "I'm not a legend because of the shots I made or the battles I fought," Frank continued. "I'm a legend because I knew when to stand still, when to wait. And most importantly, I knew when to walk away." Jason stood silently, unsure of how to respond. Frank's words held more weight than anything he had ever heard. "There's something they don't teach you in the academy," Frank said, a slight edge to his tone. "They don't teach you how to endure. They don't teach you how to survive the moments when everything seems lost. When you're out there, and it's just you, the rifle, and the silence, well, that's when you learn who you really are." Jason swallowed, his throat dry. He had heard stories, of course, everyone had. But hearing it from Frank, hearing it so matter-of-factly, made it feel different. Real. "I remember one time," Frank continued, his gaze drifting to the horizon, "I was stuck behind enemy lines, no backup, no comms. Just me and a handful of men who were already broken by the time we got to the front. We had to keep moving, even though every step felt like it might be our last. Jason took a step closer, his curiosity piqued. How did you do it? How did you keep going? Frank gave a small chuckle, his eyes twinkling with the faintest hint of a memory. You just do. You find something that keeps you moving. It could be the sound of your comrades' voices, the promise of a better day, or just the fact that you know you're not alone. Even when you are. Jason was silent for a long time, absorbing every word, feeling a sense of awe that he couldn't quite explain. He had been trained to react, to move, to follow orders without question. But Frank's words, his calm demeanor, spoke of a deeper kind of strength, one that couldn't be taught in any classroom. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the base as Frank stood up and grabbed his rifle. You'll understand one day, son, he said, his voice gruff but gentle. But for now, keep learning. Keep watching. There's more to this life than what you're told to see. Jason nodded, his mind racing with the weight of Frank's words. As Frank turned to leave, Jason felt a shift within him. The respect he had once shown Frank had deepened into something more, something that came with the realization that Frank was more than just a soldier. He was a living testament to a different kind of heroism, one that didn't rely on fame, but on the quiet, enduring strength of a life well lived. The days blended into one another, and as the season shifted, so did the atmosphere around Frank Mason. The respect that had once been an unspoken thing now filled the air wherever he went. No longer was he the quiet old man at the edge of the base. He had become a figure of quiet strength, a reminder of the deeper truths that the young soldiers often overlooked. One crisp morning, as Frank sat on the bench outside the barracks, Captain Jack Carter approached him once again. This time, his stride was slower, his expression thoughtful. Frank, Jack said, his voice hesitant, as though unsure of how to begin. Frank looked up, his weathered face as unreadable as ever. Captain, he replied simply, acknowledging Jack's presence without fanfare. Jack took a seat beside him, the silence between them comfortable, as if neither man needed to rush to speak. Finally, Jack broke the quiet. I've been thinking a lot about what you said. About the difference between reacting and enduring. And about how you just keep going, even when everything seems like it's falling apart. Frank didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stared ahead, his eyes narrowing slightly as he looked at the horizon. I didn't always know how to keep going, Frank said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of years. I didn't always know what to do when the world seemed to be breaking apart around me. But you learn. You learn that it's not about making things perfect. It's about making them through. Jack looked at Frank, his mind racing. The old man's words had a way of sticking with him, and every conversation with Frank felt like another lesson, another step toward understanding the kind of soldier and person he wanted to be. You never let anything get to you, do you? Jack asked, his tone mixed with admiration and curiosity. Frank finally turned to face him, his eyes meeting Jack's. It's not that I don't feel it, he said. It's that I know how to live with it. Every battle, every scar, they stay with you. But the trick is not to let them define you. You can't let the past control who you are in the present. Jack sat back, letting Frank's words sink in. It wasn't the kind of thing they taught at the academy. There, everything was about precision, about following orders. There was no room for the kind of wisdom Frank spoke of, wisdom that only came from surviving, from pushing through the hardest moments life could throw at you. As Frank stood to leave, Jack followed him with his eyes. You've been a hell of a teacher, Frank, he said, his voice full of respect. Frank didn't look back, but his lips curled into a faint smile. You're learning, Jack, he said simply. That's all. Any of us can do. Over the next few weeks, Jack found himself putting Frank's lessons into practice. The way Frank moved through life, his calmness in the face of adversity, became a guiding principle for Jack. It wasn't about trying to be perfect. It was about trying to be better than you were yesterday. As Jack continued his training, he noticed a shift in the way he viewed the world. He no longer saw challenges as obstacles to overcome but as opportunities to grow. And as he watched Frank from a distance, he realized that the old man was teaching him something even more important than the skills of war. Frank was teaching him the art of living with purpose, of enduring in a world that often seemed to demand too much from those who gave everything. Frank had been through it all, yet he never sought glory or recognition. He had earned respect the hard way, through years of quiet dedication, through survival, and through the understanding that life was about what you left behind, not what you took with you. One afternoon, as Jack stood in the training yard, watching Frank prepare his rifle once more, he realized that he had become more than just a soldier. He had become a man who understood the value of strength, not just in his body, but in his heart. And for that, he had Frank to thank. Weeks had passed since Frank Mason had made his presence known in the training yard. The soldiers, once skeptical of the old man and his slow, deliberate movements, now saw him for what he truly was, an embodiment of experience, wisdom, and quiet strength. Jack Carter had learned more from Frank than he ever could have in the academy. But there was something deeper he needed to understand. One morning, as the sun began to rise over the base, Jack found himself walking toward the bench where Frank was always seated, rifle in hand, his attention focused on the distant horizon. The older man looked up as Jack approached, his eyes scanning the horizon, but his body relaxed, the rifle resting in his lap. "Morning, Captain," Frank said, his voice as steady as always. Jack paused for a moment before sitting down beside him. "Frank, I've been thinking a lot about what you said, the part about living with the past, not letting it define you. I think I understand it now," but Jack trailed off, trying to find the right words. "But what, Jack?" Frank asked, his voice calm, unhurried. "But there's still something that's been bothering me," Jack admitted. "It's the way you never talk about your past. I mean, I know you've been through hell. You've done things that most of us will never understand. Yet you never bring it up. Why?" Frank chuckled softly, a quiet sound that barely reached Jack's ears. "Because it's not about the past anymore, son. It's about today. What I've done, what I've seen, it doesn't matter if I can't do something with it now. It's not about seeking recognition or proving anything. It's about what I can still do for others. What I can still teach." Jack listened closely, his brow furrowing as he processed Frank's words. "But isn't it hard?" Jack asked, his voice lower now. "To carry all that weight and never share it? To never talk about the things you've seen, the lives you've lost?" Frank's gaze shifted to the side, his eyes narrowing slightly as if searching for something beyond the base, something far off in the distance. "Yeah," he said, his voice gruff but quiet. "It's hard. But you learn how to carry it. You learn how to live with it without letting it control you. And you do it because you can't let the past take over your life. You can't let the things you've done, the things you've seen, make you someone you don't want to be." Jack thought about this for a moment, feeling a wave of understanding wash over him. Frank's words weren't just about military life. They were about life itself, the way people face their own battles, both on and off the field. It wasn't the things that had happened to them that defined them, it was how they chose to move forward. "I guess it's about finding peace with it all, isn't it?" Jack said slowly. Frank nodded, his expression softening. "Exactly. Peace isn't about forgetting or erasing what happened. It's about learning to live with it, learning to use it to be a better man. And that's all any of us can do." Jack sat in silence beside Frank, the weight of his words settling deeply in his chest. He had spent so much of his life focused on proving himself, on trying to be the best, to be the one who always had the answers. But what Frank was teaching him, what he had shown him over the weeks, was that true strength didn't come from being the best. It came from enduring, from surviving, and from helping others. The silence between them was comfortable now, filled with understanding and respect. Frank was no longer just the old man with the rifle. He was the mentor, the guide, the one who had shown Jack a way to be better not just as a soldier, but as a man. As the sun continued to rise, Jack turned to Frank, his voice steady now. "Thanks, Frank. I don't think I'll ever be able to repay you for what you've taught me. Frank gave him a half smile, his eyes twinkling with a quiet wisdom. You don't need to, son. Just keep learning. Keep living. Jack nodded, and for the first time, he understood that Frank's lessons weren't just about surviving the battlefield. They were about surviving life itself. The sun was setting over the base, casting long shadows across the training field. Frank Mason sat quietly on the bench, his rifle resting beside him as he watched the soldiers moving in the distance. It had been weeks since he had first stepped onto the base, and things had changed in ways he hadn't expected. The soldiers, who once ignored him or mocked him, now respected him, not because he sought it, but because he had earned it. Jack Carter was one of the first to approach him. His once brash demeanor had softened, replaced by a calm understanding that only came with time and experience. Frank, Jack said, his voice a little more serious than usual. I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about not letting the past control you. I thought I understood it, but it's harder than I thought. Frank looked at him, his eyes steady and calm. It's always harder than it seems, Jack, he replied, his voice low. But that's the thing about life. It's never easy, and it's never the way you expect it to be. The important thing is that you keep moving forward. Jack took a seat beside him, his gaze fixed on the horizon. How do you do it? How do you keep going after everything you've been through? Frank's expression softened, and he leaned back slightly, the weight of his years hanging on him like a heavy coat. You do it because you have no choice, Frank said. You do it because you have something to live for, even if it's just one more day, one more chance to make a difference. You do it because the world doesn't stop, and neither can you. Jack sat silently, processing Frank's words. There was a depth to the old man that went beyond the stories and the lessons. It wasn't just about surviving, it was about finding purpose in the quiet moments, in the spaces between the chaos. I don't know if I'm ready for all of this, Jack admitted, his voice tinged with doubt. I don't know if I'm ready to carry all that weight. Frank turned to him, his gaze piercing yet understanding. You're never ready, Jack. No one is. You just have to take it, piece by piece. You'll make mistakes, and that's okay. But you have to learn from them. You have to be willing to keep going, even when it feels like you're not enough. Jack's eyes lingered on Frank for a long moment. The old man had seen it all, war, loss, survival. And yet, he still carried on, still found meaning in each day. I'm not sure I'll ever be as strong as you, Jack said quietly. Frank chuckled softly, the sound warm and familiar. You don't have to be like me, Jack, he said. You just have to be the best version of yourself. That's all anyone can ask for. The sky darkened, and the last rays of the sun dipped below the horizon, leaving behind a quiet stillness. Jack sat there for a while, letting the silence settle around him. He had learned more from Frank in the past few weeks than he had in all his years of training. Not just about the battlefield, but about life, about how to carry the weight of the world without letting it break you. The soldiers continued their training in the distance, but Jack felt a sense of peace that he hadn't felt before. He knew that he had a long way to go, but with Frank's lessons in his heart, he felt ready to face whatever came next. As the night settled in, Jack stood up, feeling a sense of calm he hadn't known before. He walked away from the bench, his mind clear, his purpose solidified. And as he looked back toward the field, he knew that Frank's legacy wasn't just about the lessons he had taught him. It was about the quiet strength that came from enduring, from surviving, and from never giving up. Months had passed since the day Frank Mason had set the example that would shape Jack Carter's understanding of what it meant to be a soldier and a man. The base had changed in subtle ways. The men who had once dismissed Frank were now seeking his wisdom, his calm, and his quiet strength. Jack had become a better leader because of Frank, more thoughtful and patient. But there was something missing. Jack still hadn't fully let go of his old self, the one who felt he needed to prove something, the one who struggled with being vulnerable. One late afternoon, as Jack walked through the quiet training grounds, he spotted Frank sitting by the old oak tree, his rifle resting at his side. He had become a fixture here, an ever-present reminder that strength wasn't just about physical prowess, it was about enduring, about the things you carried inside. Jack hesitated for a moment, then made his way over. Frank looked up as he approached, his face breaking into a small, knowing smile. "Captain," Frank said, his voice always steady, never hurried. "Frank," Jack replied, sitting down next to him. For a moment, they just sat there, watching the soldiers in the distance, the quiet of the evening enveloping them. "I've been thinking," Jack began, his voice serious. "I don't know if I've learned everything I need to learn from you." Frank raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What do you mean?" "I'm still holding onto something," Jack admitted. "I'm not sure I know how to truly let go of the past, to stop trying to prove something. I feel like I've been trying so hard to be something, someone else. I don't know if I'm being honest with myself." Frank turned toward him, his eyes sharp but filled with understanding. "It's not about being someone else, Jack. It's about being the best version of who you are. You don't need to prove anything. You've already proven yourself in the way you've led your men, in the way you've shown up every single day." Jack looked down at his hands, his mind racing. "I guess I've always believed that being a leader meant always being the strongest, the most confident. But now, I see that maybe I've been wrong." Frank leaned back against the tree, his weathered face softening. "You've never been wrong, Jack. You've been learning. We all are. The moment you stop learning, that's when you've stopped living. It's not about being perfect. It's about being real. And sometimes, being real means showing your weakness, your vulnerability. You can't always carry everything on your own. That's why we have each other." Jack nodded, taking in Frank's words, feeling the weight of them settle into his chest. It was a shift, something deep and fundamental. The old fears, the old insecurities, slowly began to fade as he realized that he didn't need to keep pretending to be something he wasn't. He didn't need to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders. He just needed to be honest, to lead with humility, and to trust his men. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm golden glow over the field, Jack felt something inside him finally click. He stood up, taking a deep breath, a newfound clarity in his eyes. "Thank you, Frank," he said, his voice filled with gratitude. Frank gave him a nod, his expression calm and approving. "You're welcome, son. Just keep going. Keep being you." Jack turned and walked back toward the base, a sense of peace in his heart that he hadn't felt before. The journey wasn't over, but for the first time, he didn't feel the need to rush toward some distant goal. He was right where he needed to be, learning, growing, and becoming the man and leader he was always meant to be. The weeks turned into months, and the base had become more than just a place of training. For Jack Carter, it had become a place of personal transformation. He no longer saw it as just the place where soldiers learned to fight. It was where they learned to live, to face their fears, and to grow stronger, not just physically, but mentally and emotionally. Frank Mason had become more than just a mentor, he had become a guide, showing Jack and the others the power of resilience and humility. One crisp autumn morning, Jack found himself walking along the edge of the training yard, his mind clear and his steps purposeful. The young soldiers, now more accustomed to his leadership, moved in unison, working through drills and exercises. Jack was no longer just the officer in charge. He had become someone they respected, not because of his rank, but because of what he had learned and what he had shared. As he passed by the barracks, he saw Frank sitting on the same bench he had always occupied, rifle in hand, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Frank had a way of making even the simplest moments seem profound. Jack approached him slowly, the sound of his boots crunching on the gravel breaking the silence. Frank looked up, his eyes meeting Jack's with the same calm, steady gaze he always had. "Captain," Frank said, his voice low, but there was something different in it this time, a note of approval. Jack smiled slightly and took a seat beside him. "Frank," he said quietly, "I've been thinking a lot about everything you've taught me. The way you live your life. How you handle everything with such quiet strength." Frank didn't respond immediately. Instead, he glanced over at Jack, as if weighing his words. Strength comes in many forms, Jack, Frank said, his voice steady. It's not always about being the strongest or the toughest. Sometimes, it's about knowing when to step back, when to listen, when to let others lead. The key is balance. You can't carry the weight of the world on your own. And you can't push forward without knowing when to pause. Jack nodded, feeling the truth of Frank's words settle deep within him. I think I understand now, Jack said, his voice reflecting the growth he had undergone. It's not about being perfect. It's about being present. About being real with the people around you. Frank's lips curled into a small smile. Exactly, Jack. You've learned more than you think. For a moment, they both sat in silence, watching the soldiers in the distance, their movements synchronized and focused. The sun was rising higher in the sky, casting a warm light over the base, and for the first time, Jack didn't feel the weight of the world on his shoulders. He had found his purpose, not just as a leader, but as a man who understood the value of living with humility, strength, and purpose. As the day went on, Jack took on his responsibilities with a renewed sense of clarity. He led with confidence, not because he needed to prove anything, but because he had learned the value of true leadership. It was about helping others grow, about teaching them the lessons Frank had taught him, and showing them the power of quiet resilience. Frank had shown him that life wasn't about the victories you won or the battles you fought. It was about the lessons you learned along the way you carried those lessons with you, and the way you shared them with others. As Jack walked back toward the training field, he felt a sense of peace that had been missing for so long. He wasn't the perfect leader, and he wasn't trying to be. But he had found something far more valuable, he had found the strength to be himself.